All right. Okay.
Oh, let me like get a hello.
Yes. Hello. Okay. I will just go over this question with you guys. So let me share my screen one more time. Okay. So when I execute this loop, I get like a bunch of outputs. But okay, so these loops are not like our typical loops that we went over last time where the I increments by 1 or j decrements by 1. So if you look at our first loop, our I actually increments by 5. So first, we start out with I equals 0 here. So we print out our I at the beginning, which is 0. Then we look at our second for loop, and this one, our j starts at 4, and we're decrementing by 2. So it'll first print out j equals 4, and then it'll decrement j by 2, so it'll print out j equals 2, and then it'll print out once again j equals 0 because we're decrementing by 2. And because j is greater than or equal to 0, this loop stops, and then we go back to our first loop. So now our I increments by 5. So our I is 5 now. And then we go through the same nested for loop where j starts out at 4, and then we keep printing j until it is 0. So we have j equals 4, j equals 2, and j equals 0. Then we go back to our outer loop again, and then we increment our I by 5. So we have I equals 10 now. And then we do the same thing where we print out j equals 4, decrement j by 2, so we have j equals 2, and then we have j equals 0. And then lastly, we have our I equals 15 because we did 10 plus 5. And then we're doing the same thing by printing out j equals 4, j equals 2, and j equals 0. So now because our I has reached 15 and our condition says that we are running this loop while I is less than or equal to 15, so we stop our loop here. Okay. So now I will quickly go over different examples of data structures before we go into arrays. So I will go over stacks first. I'm not sure if you guys have reviewed this or covered this in class, but I'm just gonna quickly go over it with you. So stack is basically a container of objects that are inserted and removed according to the last in and first out principle. So this is a diagram of a stack. So if you look at this, we have a thing called push and pop here. So in the stack, we can only have 2 operations, which are called the push and pop. And push, this this operation pushes the item into the stack. And pop, it pops the item out of the stack. So basically, elements can be added and removed from the stack using these push and pop, and the elements can be only added at the top of the stack. So when you push an element, this element gets added to the top of the stack, which is right here. And then when you do pop an element, it removes the item from the top. So basically the same element. So this is called the last in first out principle because what you put in last, well, first, if you put in something, you get put in here, then here, 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 here. And then whatever you put in last gets popped out first. That's why it's called the last in and first out principle. So a helpful analogy of a stack is to think about like stack of books. So when you add books, you add the books on top of each other like in layers. And then when you want to take out a book, you remove the book from the top of the stack instead of from the bottom because you don't want all the books to fall out. Do you guys have any questions on this, on stack? Okay. Then I will go over one more thing, which is called cues. So this diagram is a representation of a cue. So basically a cue is kind of similar to stack because it's like a container of objects, but this works in the first in and first out principle. So like a good example of a queue is a line of students in the food court. So whoever gets there first or gets in line first is served food first. So the new addition to a line is made to the back of the queue. So like right here to the back. And when you remove an element, that happens at the front. So in queue, we have two operations called the enqueue and dequeue. Basically what this does is you insert an element to the back of the queue, and then when you dequeue something, you remove the element from the front of the line. So this is called the first in and first out principle. So the difference between stacks and queues is basically in the removing part, because in a stack, we remove the first item, remove the item that was most recently added. But in a queue, we remove the item that was added at the very beginning or added first. Does anyone have questions on queues? Okay. Did you guys go over these in class along with arrays? No? Okay. I don't think these are on the AP exam, but I think your teacher might go over them with you. It's just like good to know along with like arrays. These are just like different types of storing data. Okay, and then we will now go over the basics of arrays, and I will pass it on to Hannah.
Okay guys, so today our main lesson is going to be on arrays. So first, just to define an array for you guys, an array is consecutive storage for multiple items of the same type. And so basically you store values in an array using an index, which is a location within that array. And then you can get those values back from the array by going to that index. So if you were to think of an array in terms of a real world object, a lot of people like to compare arrays to a row of lockers because it's a consecutive line of storage. But the difference between a real life locker and an array is that you can only store one thing in each place in an array at a time, versus in a locker you could probably store more than one things. So arrays are useful whenever you have several elements of the same data type that you want to keep track of, but you don't really need to name each individual one. So that is just a basic definition of arrays, and now I'm going to show you guys some code using them to help you better understand them. Because if you guys have not gone over arrays in class already, they are very important and come up a lot. So arrays are something that you should have a very good understanding of for the AP test. So we're just going to use Eclipse here. So to declare an array in Java, you have this syntax where you specify the data type of the array, and then you do these two square brackets to indicate that you are declaring an array, and then you name it. So here I am declaring an integer array called myArray. But this doesn't actually create the array, it just declares it. So then here in this next line, we are instantiating the array to be a new integer array of size 8. So basically what this line is doing, like I said, here we are declaring an array, but we're not actually creating it yet because an array is an object. So just like you would do with any other Java object, you have to actually instantiate it using the new keyword. And then after that, we are going to declare it as a new integer array. And we are going to specify the size of the array, so how many elements we want it to store. And you can also do this all in one line. So here in this line, we are declaring a Boolean array called myArray2, and it's going to be equal to a Boolean array object of size 8. And so something that is important about arrays that you can see by this declaration is that when you create an array, you can only store one type of object. So this array can only store Boolean values, and this array up here can only store integer values. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So next we are going to talk about how you store and then get back out items in an array. So like I said, you access array items using an index. So we're going to uncomment this code. And so here we have another array that I'm instantiating. It's going to be an array called test scores that stores 5 integer values. And so the way that you access an array index is you tell Java what array you're trying to access, so here test scores, and then inside of the brackets you are going to specify which index you want to access. So here we are going to access the whole array since it is an array of 5 values. And indexing an array starts at 0 and not 1. So that's something important to remember that can be kind of tricky. So like I said, since this array is an array of 5 values, our indexes are going to go from 0 to 4, not 1 to 5. And so here we are setting the value at the 0th index equal to 90. And then we're setting the value at the first index equal to 80. The second index equal to 50, third equal to 100, and fourth equal to 57. So then to access these elements, we are just going to tell Java what array we want to access, and then the index of the element we want to access. So in this line, we are just going to print out the value of the test scores array at index 2. So if we run this, it is going to print out 50 because over here we declared test scores 2 to be 50. So what do you guys think is going to happen if I run this line of code? If we just try to print out the whole test scores array? Any guesses? Okay, so like I said earlier, an array is an object in Java. So if you try to print out the whole array, it's actually going to print out the address of where that object is stored in Java. So you guys have probably seen before, this is what happens when you try to print out any object in Java. It's going to print out its address. And so trying to print out an array is going to do the exact same thing since an array is really just an object. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So let's comment this back up. So let's say that you were to declare an array in Java, but you don't actually specify what the values are yet. So if we go back up to the arrays that we declared here, an integer array and a Boolean array, we never actually specify what any of the values at any of the indexes are. So Java just automatically sets these values for us. And for an integer array, it's going to set all of the values to 0. And for a Boolean array, it's going to set all the values to false. Also, if you were to do an array of float values or double values, it's also going to set it to 0. So this is another way that you can create an array in Java. You can actually initialize the starting values when you create the array. So here we have an integer array called weekly forecast. And if you see here, we are just using these curly brackets. And inside the curly brackets, we are going to declare all of the values that we want in the array when we create it. So this is some useful syntax that you can use if you know at the very beginning of your program what you are going to want the values of the array to be, because it's a little bit simpler and it's all in one line. So here we have an array of string values, and here we have an array of Boolean values, all using this syntax. So I'm going to show you a picture of kind of a visual representation of what these arrays look like in Java to help you guys visualize it, because I know that helps me a lot. So we are just going to look at a picture from the ebook. So this is a picture of kind of what an array represents. So here we have an integer array called high scores, and you can see each box represents an index of the array, and then we have the value of each in the array. And then down here we have our name array that we created in that previous program, but notice that it looks a little bit different than the integer array. And this is because the values in our names array are objects. And so what we are doing in each of the indexes, instead of storing a value, we are storing a reference to another object. So that is why you sort of have this pointer, because we aren't storing the actual values of our string objects. We're storing a reference to the object. Does that make sense? Okay. So now if we go back to Eclipse, one second. Now we are going to talk really quickly about the length of an array. So like I said earlier, when you create an array, it has a length which is equal to how many values it has stored. And so since arrays are an object in Java, we can actually access their length using a built-in field that Java has created for us called length. So since this is a built-in field that has public access, all we have to do to access it is just use the dot notation. And so you can say any array that you have, dot length, and it will give you the length of the array. So this first array has a length of 5 because there are 5 values. The second one also has 5 values. And then the third one has 3 values. And this is a little bit different from if you remember when we went over strings. To access the length of a string, you use length with parentheses. And that is because length is a method of the string class. It's not a value that Java already has stored for us. So that is why for an array you use dot length, because it is a field of the array object, versus when you have a string, length is a method that you can use to get that value. And so on the AP test, if you accidentally mix it up and say vals.length, off points, but it's still just useful to know the difference and kind of why they are different. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay. I think that that is everything that I wanted to go over on arrays. So now Jack is going to take us through some questions to test your guys' knowledge.
Let me just go over the for each loop real quick before the questions. Is that fine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay. So so for our loops last week, we went over our for loop and while loop, but there's actually one more loop called for each loop. And basically, you will often want to loop through all the elements of an array. So instead of like looking at like different parts of the elements in an array, or like instead of like skipping around in the array, when you use a for each loop, this will actually go through every single element of your array in order. So you will want to use a for each loop when you want to loop through all the elements of an array. So basically, a for each loop is a loop that can only be used on arrays or like a collection of items, and it will loop through each item in your array. So if you look at the code here, in line 6, this is our beginning of our loop. So this is basically our for loop. So this val right here is basically like the integer I in a for loop. So you're setting an integer called val to every element of your values. So if you look at your main, you declare an array called values, which consists of integers 2, 6, 7, 12, and 5. So when you call this function getAverage, passing in your values array, what this loop does is it basically loops through every single element in your values array. So first, in the beginning, your val will be set to integer 2. So when you do total equals total plus val, you have 0 for total at first, and what you would do is you will do 0 plus 2. Then your val will be set to your second element, which is 6, and then you'll do 2 plus 6. And then your val will be set to your third element, and then it'll add that to your total. Then your val will be set to your fourth element, add this number to your total, and then you would finally add your last element to your total. And then after you finish running through your loop, what it does is you get the total and you divide the total by values.length, which is basically the number of numbers or the elements in your array. So this would actually return right here, 6.4. So it just like basically returns the average of the numbers in your array. So the major difference between like a for loop and a for each loop is that for, like as I've said before, in a for each loop, you have to go through every single item in an array and in order. So you can't really go backwards or skip elements. But with regular for loops, you can do that by setting your I equal to some number that you want to increment by like 2. Then you can look at every other element in an array, and typically you would not be able to do that with a for each loop. Okay, so that was everything that I wanted to say about for each loop, and then now Jack will go through practice problems with you guys.
Awesome. So yeah, hopefully you got a good understanding about for each loops as well as arrays through Hannah and Seven session. So now what I'm about to post is I'm going to post the link to tonight's practice questions. You'll see it's a mix of multiple choice questions and coding questions itself, because that's something you would expect to see on the AP exam. So if you guys want to go ahead and start filling those out, if you have any issues, you don't understand any of the questions, feel free to ask for more clarification. I try to make them as straightforward as possible. So I hope you guys do well. I know these questions are kind of hard, but even if you don't know the answer, if we could try to just write the ones you're confused about. We're going to try to finish within the next 5 minutes so we can start going over the questions. Okay. If you haven't submitted them yet, that's okay. We're just make sure we finish roughly on time. We're gonna start going them over now. Hopefully this will explain some clarification, maybe some good ways to approach the problems if you found yourself getting stuck on one. But yeah, we'll just start going them over them from the beginning. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And so we're going to look at this first question here. So the first question is, how many elements are in an array? And the correct answer we were looking for was actually array.length. So something really important to remember about arrays is that they know their own length. So this should automatically eliminate the 2 with the parentheses. Unlike strings, arrays don't need to call any method to be able to solve it. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is the reason why it was array.length and not array.length minus 1 is because array.length is really counting all the elements in the array. Based off of your answers from the later questions, it seems that everyone understands that the last element of an array will be array.length minus 1. But because we start at element 0, that still gets counted in our quest to find the actual array length. So therefore, an array.length would be the correct answer here. I know this one's a little tricky one, but be especially careful, for arrays appear in a lot of the multiple choice questions, so understanding this concept will affect your answers later on. The next question asks you to write a code that creates and returns a new array that contains the partial sums of all elements in the parameter array. So I'm going to open up Eclipse. And so here's our example where we were hoping to find a new array where the result would be 1, and then here for the second element it would be 6 because that's the result of 5 plus 1. And the element after that it would be 9 because that would be 6 plus 3. And then finally 13. So if we go down, so we're going to just try to code this ourselves. To remove the return statement. And one thing that we want to make sure is when this question was presented, we need to make sure, so here is the method header, and we always want to make sure we're using the kind of parameters that are given, but also it's just good practice to, instead of editing the array they give you, trying to create a new array so we're not modifying the original. This doesn't matter too much in Java, but as you go on to later computer science courses, this can have an impact. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a new array. We can call this array maybe sums. So again, it's an array, so we need that. And when we create our new array, we don't know the size of it necessarily, but we have to go based off of original length. And again, here we need to use original.length and not original.length minus 1 to make sure we have enough space to have our entire result. So you all seem to understand the need of a for loop that goes to every element. So let's say we're going to just try with I equals 1, for example. Length, I plus plus. And then for the most part, we seem to understand that sums I, so the element we're editing, is equal to sums, and then I minus 1, and then plus original I. Some of you use a counter, an int counter, to get track of running sum, and that works too. There's a lot of different ways to handle this problem to get the right one. Does anyone see a problem with this code? Already, we should have faced some kind of problem that this will not return the result we're looking for. Can anyone see what that problem is? So one thing that's wrong with this right from the get-go is we don't have a return statement. So we can easily return, and this will get rid of this error, return sums. But there's still something else that's wrong with this code. And one thing you might notice is that the array starts with, my loop starts with index 1, but arrays, remember, it's really important to remember that arrays start with 0. And that's why the length is, the actual length of the array is equal to the actual length instead of length minus 1, because our arrays start with 0 and we count every element from 0 to length minus 1. But the other thing, the reason why this loop, if this loop now starts at 0, that doesn't really help our issue at all, because this is dependent on I minus 1. And if I is 0, well, you can't have a negative value for our array. So for the loop to work the way it was written here, we will need a 1 in its place. However, we still need to make sure we update our first element, and we can do that by having sums 0 equal original 0 here. And that way, the first element keeps its integrity, and that way everything else in this later function kind of depends on it. For those of you who took a for each method in approach to this, the way your for each loop should have looked is for int like current, and then been based off of the original. And what error is it giving me here? Oh, I was just telling, we can ignore this because it comes before the return statement. But we can just move the return statement down so it doesn't give us a bug. So yeah, if you use the sums method, remember, this is the format you need. This right here, this first part is reliant on int, not based off of an array. Although the array really doesn't mean anything, for current is going to represent the specific element in the array you're looking at. So we would need an integer value here. And again, this would work if you kept track of your sums. But again, remember that you should be modifying a new array that you're returning as opposed to modifying the original. So yeah, other than that, your responses looked pretty good. And if we were going to run this program right now, we should find that our result is equal to what we went over earlier with the 1, 6, 9, 13. Let's wait for this to run. 1, 6, 9, 13. Ignore that null pointer exception at the end. That's just because we haven't put in our result for question 2 yet. But yeah, other than that, you'll see that that code returns the right result. Does anyone have any questions about number 2 before we move on to number 3? Again, I can put the code up longer if you would like to see more of that. Okay, so then let's move on to the next question. We've had a multiple choice question here. What we're really looking for is, when is true returned? So one really tricky thing about this question was, if you look here, the value of AI is constantly being changed to equal val. So this one, it seemed like a lot of people got it wrong, so we're going to make sure we go into it in depth. So first, our Boolean temp is equal to false. So like Hannah does, I would really suggest drawing a diagram to help work yourself through it, so we can keep track of what temp is as this program iterates. So for int I equals 0, I is less than a dot length, so it's going to go through all of the different values in our array. Temp is equal to whether or not AI equals some value. So this temp is going to be updated every single time that this is run until eventually temp is what's returned. So temp is not returned until the very end. Notice how the temp is returned outside the for loop. So what we really need to look at is what is the final value of temp when the last iteration of this loop is run. Because temp is changed every time it advances, all the intermediate values of temp will not be returned. So therefore, true, we know, is going to be returned only when the last element in A is equal to val. So therefore, this would be true. If the last value of A did not equal val, temp would return false. It didn't matter when the last value, or if any previous value equaled true, because temp is being returned at the end. Let's say we changed up our code a little bit though, and we moved our return statement inside here. And let's edit the spacing. Now, what do you guys think would be returned? When would temp return true? So again, we're trying to figure out when temp returns true. And temp is a Boolean value, so therefore this function that this code will be in is only looking for one Boolean answer. So we're just going to go through it over and over again until we can hit a return statement. And the moment you hit the return statement, what Java does, it exits immediately and just returns that value. I know we haven't really got into functions yet too in depth, but just let's play around here. So what we're really looking to do here is once temp is only going to see that value of AI 0, so the first element in the array. Temp is then going to equal the first, whether or not the first element in the array is equal to our value. If this is true, temp will equal true. If not, temp will equal false. And right away, we return that value immediately as we hear. This loop does not run a second time or third time, and I will never be anything greater than 0 because we return right away. So temp will be returned, and this will be true whenever the first element in A is equal to val and false otherwise. And as we can see how to play around with this, we can edit the place of our return statement to get different answers. if we wanted to create a function that returned true if any of the values in A equaled val, we would have to change temp, the value of temp here. So here, what we could do is we could equals temp, or if AI equals val. Because essentially, by adding this, what we're saying is if temp is true, we'll keep the value of temp as true, or if the current value of AI is equal to val, the certain value, then we're going to change temp to true. And this would just check to see if any of the elements in our array A are equal to val. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about how we can manipulate A's and keep track of Booleans to see what values are equal to an outside variable? So yeah, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the sidebar now, or let me know if we're okay to keep going. Okay. Wait, have you guys covered functions in your class? Sorry, I probably should have asked this. Oh no. Okay. So I'll definitely, okay, that makes a lot more sense. I'm sorry. Sorry, we're going a little ahead here. But yeah, so then we'll just look at the code itself and ignore functions. I know that might have made the questions a little bit confusing, and this one's definitely on me. But we'll definitely take that in mind when going over the other answers. So yeah, but we can still go over the content to make sure you guys understand the ideas. The next question we're going to go over is a multiple choice question, which did not involve functions, I believe. So the next, just kidding. The next one is a code one. And we're going to write a code that stores a string as a character array by storing one letter in each section of the array. And you guys really seem to understand this idea right here. But just remember the key things that we need to take in mind when we handle our strings. So right here, we're dealing with a string S. So string S is given. So like this is, so what we're going to do is like here, since you haven't done with functions, we're just going to code. We're going to put it here, but we're just going to start off the code with a string given equals S. So we're given a string. For example, we can pretend that the string equals hello for the sake of this example. So again, the first, we're going to need to create a new array to store our result. We can just call this array result equals new char, because that's the type of array it is. And then we need to have given dot length. One really important thing to keep in mind here is Eclipse not responding. Oh, great, it's not responding. Okay. Yikes. Okay. Length. Because our string called given is a string and not an array, we need these parentheses here. While arrays know their own length, strings don't. So therefore, when you try to find the length of a string, we need to have these parentheses so we can find out. This itself is like calling a function on the string, but you guys will go over that and we'll cover that in some of the next webinars. But as for now, it's just easier to memorize that string. When you find a string length, you need these parentheses. When you find an array length, you don't. So if we go into our for loop, for int I equals 0, I is less than, let's say we want our result dot length. Because here we are dealing with an array, we don't have the parentheses to find the length of the array itself, I++. For now, you guys seem to really understand this idea that result I would equal our substring call of I and then I+1. And again, why is this not liking me? Why are you being funky? Okay. Oh, because this is looking for a char and not a string. So we would need to convert this string to a char. So this is so that would require calling a different function, which we didn't go over. So as long as you guys got this basic idea, which you guys seem to get, the function itself to convert a string to a char is not on the AP. But since you guys seem to understand this idea, we're just going to move on. And then at the end, because it's a function, but you guys have not covered them, he would just return your result. But yeah, I'm really not too concerned about that question because you guys really seem to get the idea. Again, the real thing to keep in mind is that when you're finding the length of a string, you need to use the parentheses after dot length. But when you're finding the length of an array, you don't need them. So we can move on to the final multiple choice question. And that was, what is the sum of the numbers in the array? Int array equals new int 10. And this kind of goes on to the point that Hannah covered at the end of talking about arrays, is that if an array is not given a set of values, such as here, it's just initialized, Java is going to assign values to all the indexes in your array for you. For example, if it's a Boolean array, all of the things in the Boolean, does anyone remember if they were going to be true or false? Anyone remember from Hannah's? If you initialize a Boolean array, what are all the values by default? Yeah, false is correct. And 0 is what all the values would be if the array was an int. So yeah, our problem dealt with an int array, and because none of the values were specified, the sum, if you were to take the sum of all the values in our array here, you would find that the result was 0. Again, the sum of the numbers in the array deals with the values themselves and not the indexes. You will never really be summing the indexes of an array. So although 45 is what you get, you guys seem to understand that the starting index was 0 and the ending index was 9. We really weren't looking for that in that problem. But other than that, you seem to understand the ideas. So yeah, 0 is the default value for any uninitialized integer array, and then false would be that for uninitialized Boolean arrays. Does that make more sense? Does anyone have any questions about default values or arrays in general that we can answer before we conclude this webinar? No? I'll give you guys a minute in case you are typing questions. Are for each loops only for arrays, or can they be used for other objects? That's a really good question. So for each loops can be used for any type of list object. So for example, later on we'll cover array list, which is kind of a version of arrays, or anything that is like a collection of objects, then for each loops can be used. For the AP exam, you will only learn about arrays, so that's the only time in this class you'll see them. But if you continue studying computer science, you'll learn about some different data structures, which also can be used with for each loops. Yeah, my pleasure. If you guys have any individual questions themselves, I just pasted the link to tutoring. So again, you can sign up for one-on-one sessions. The calendar has not been updated with this week's availability yet, but it should go out soon. All three, Hannah, Seben, and myself, will offer one-on-one tutoring sessions, and we encourage you to sign up. If you need individualized help, have a concern about a specific topic, maybe you have a quiz or a test in your class you have coming up and you want some additional help. Although this week's not posted, I really encourage you to copy the link, and we can also send it out in another email so you guys have access to it. But yeah, if no one else has any questions for the group, that's the end of tonight's webinar. We again want to thank you all for coming out. We really loved having you and would love to answer any additional questions you guys have. Seb and Hannah, did you guys have anything else?
Nope, I think that was it. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.
All right, bye, everyone.